So in this week's slideshow, we'll be looking at practice and the different types of practice and also feedback. The key content this week will be to look at different ways of structuring practice session. So there's two pairs there, massed and distributed, which looks at the time being spent on them and how it's distributed throughout the week or a session. And then blocked and random, which is basically drill versus game-based. So two pairs there to consider. And then the feedback is largely split around intrinsic or augmented, which just means coming from within or from outside, and then whether the feedback is based on the outcome, which is knowledge of results, or the technique, which is knowledge of performance. And the key skills there, so make sure we perform, analyse, discuss, report, observe. So the more complex question phrased as a simple question, what's the best way to practice a skill, and how can we use feedback to improve performance? So I strongly encourage that you write these questions out just to get practice of annotating them, circling the verb, underlining the key content, that kind of thing. Try and get a sense of how many marks you'd be writing for. It's just another way to, I suppose, make these PowerPoints closer to what's going to happen with the exam, which is question, answer, question, answer. In essence, you're summarising the PowerPoint, but this just gives you a greater roadmap or framework to work from. When we look at practice distribution, it actually has two meanings, or it can be ambiguous. So the first and easiest way to look at it is how you spend your training time during the week. Do you have small training sessions but a large number of them, or do you have a few number of training sessions but they go for a long period of time? Then within each session you have a look at how you're actually spending the time. If you don't have a lot of rest breaks, then you are massing practice. If you do have a lot of rest breaks, then you are distributing it. So if we unpack massed versus distributed, looking at the time allocation, on a weekly kind of level, if you're looking at those different schedules, A, B, C, D, it's as simple as having a look at which of those schedules has more sessions with less time. So it looks like Schedule C has 4 by 1 hours, and yet Schedule A has the 4 hours in 2 by 2 blocks. So Schedule A is a classic example of massed, and Schedule C is the best example there of distributed because it's 4 sessions rather than 3. Probably more likely to be discussing how you use the time within each session, whether it's massed or distributed, and it's purely based around the number of rest breaks you have, the time you take, I suppose, in terms of work to rest. So if you are on activities, and they can be any matter of activities, whether they're blocked or random, small-sided games, drills, whatever else, if you're not having rest breaks between and taking time to debrief and perhaps get some feedback or just recover and stretch and grab a drink, then you're massing your practice to maximize practice time. And if you're taking lots of rest breaks, short breaks, regardless of whether it's talking strategy or grabbing a drink or whatever else, then you're distributing the training, probably to manage the boredom and perhaps the fatigue if it's a particularly draining type of session. Mass practice simply means you're doing something repetitively for a period of time. There's no golden rule to the period of time. There's the image there of the golf balls. If you're whacking 50 or 100 golf balls, that would be an example of mass practice. Something less than 10, you would then move on to something else to have a rest, would be distributed. So regardless of the nature of the task, and we talk shortly about drill versus variable types of practice. So regardless of what you're doing, it's a matter of time you spend on the task and the periods of rest. So if you're doing it for a period of time, it's considered massed. Typically, you do it with something like discrete skills because they won't fatigue you. So your basketball shots or your golf stroke or your tennis serve. But it can also be some non-fatiguing continuous skills. If you're doing something with jogging, swimming or cycling at a relatively low intensity, then that could be considered mass practice if you're doing it for a decent period of time. The second branch, if you like, for practice is the variability of the task that you're doing. And in this case, we've got the terms blocked versus random. And blocked simply just means you repeat the same skill. So essentially it could be a drill, like a hand passing drill in a lane or a chest passing drill with 2 cones in basketball, or a dribbling drill in soccer. So you just stay on that same one motor skill, as opposed to random where you might move between. So if you were doing soccer, for example, you might chop and change from dribbling to trapping the ball to passing, possibly to taking set shots and things like this. So it's a lot more mixed, and it could even be more game-based, which is the best example of random training you can have, because games are very open and unpredictable. So further to the previous slide, Some better examples of block training might be if you're being asked to hit 10 or 20 free throws or hit 30 or 40 golf balls. So you're doing the same skill in a chunk or a block. There's an example there, or sorry, several bullet points just suggesting when it might be better suited than random practice. So work through each of those bullet points and see what you think. So in contrast, random practice isn't the same skill over and over. It's a number of skills and the situation is unpredictable or variable. It can be more game-like, but certainly is going to be, if you like, a more unstable environment. A classic example is any sort of small-sided activities you might do, even just keepings off possession, passing or kicking for like a netball, basketball, hockey, or soccer is classic random practice because it's not as predictable as doing things in lanes or in lines or just doing the one thing over and over again. If you look at those 3 bullet points, try and equate that to a random practice training you may have done. So this table really just explains the previous slide in a more colourful way. The green's good, that's the advantages, the red's the slight disadvantages, and you just need to be mindful, I suppose, of the stage of learning and the nature of the task you're asking somebody to do. So this is when you would do it, the advantages, or why you would do it, sorry, and then the disadvantages in red. You do run the risk of it being a bit tiring or making somebody feel a little bit bored and underwhelmed by what you're setting. The colour coding again, green for advantages, red for disadvantages. In terms of distributed, and always look at this, I suppose, as a counterpoint to massed. By splitting up, by dispersing the training drills, activities, whatever the nature of the task is, there's a handful of advantages there. Engaging the learners, more suited perhaps for the first time learner or cognitive learner. You're not going to get too tired, and you do get the rest periods, I suppose, to hopefully reflect. It obviously does take longer in terms of time on task. You would have less time on task in a distributed practice session typically if you have the rest periods. And it might not be so good for discrete skills. The second section for this week is feedback. And at its broader sense, it's information that you're going to receive about your performance. If you think about feedback at school and assessment and reporting, there's many types of feedback that you receive, whether it's the informal comment from a teacher or another student in class, to a written comment on a key assessment task, to any kind of written or verbal feedback you'll get from your teacher or peers, or even people like your mentors when they're having learning dialogues with you. So its purpose is to identify problems, to give you a chance to change what you're doing to improve performance, to certainly reinforce learning, and perhaps if you're of the mind that it can, if you like, inspire you or get some motivation for you. The best feedback is individualized to the person, and it's also given to them in a time frame that allows them to do something with it, to make sense of it in the first case, and perhaps then to be able to use it to inform choices and decisions for future efforts. So I've said here, just for me and just in time, which means it's specific and timely. In terms of how often you should get feedback, there's no real one rule for that. Certainly in terms of looking at stages of learning and skill acquisition, feedback, the need for feedback should reduce as a player gets better. So as they move from the cognitive to the associative to the autonomous stage, it should get less and less, as part of increasing one's skill level or proficiency is the capacity to self-diagnose and self-correct as they go through the learning process. Importantly, without feedback, there can be no learning. I really like that sentence, and take a moment to think about what that actually means. Without feedback, there can be no learning. In terms of the study design, they talk about intrinsic feedback, and then often in the text they say internal. So it comes from you and it comes from your sensory organs. So visual, sight, auditory, hearing, touch. So the gentleman there playing golf, the grip on the stick, and proprioception, which is a fancy word for knowing where your body is in time and space. If you were to jump off a diving board and close your eyes, it would be important for you to know where your body is in relation to space so that you land in the water in an appropriate angle. So that can all come from playing out a shot, doing an exercise, completing a skill, and there may also then be some feedback at the conclusion of it. If you've jarred your hand or your cricket bat on a shot, you'll feel that after the shot as well. As distinct from internal feedback is augmented feedback. Now, augmented is a fancy word meaning it comes from other people, or it's added feedback. And it can be something like technology based. I've got there some video footage and various apps and iPads, sort of screenshots and things, but it can simply be from a coach or a peer who gives you some feedback that comes from outside your own, if you like, sensory organs. Yes, you have to see it or hear it, but it's being supplied by an external source. And then conversely, we've got the knowledge of results, which simply looks at outcomes or results of the skill. So it doesn't care about the technique or the process or the skill execution. Simply, was it a goal? Did it get in the hole? Was the ball caught? Did the tennis shot go in the court? Was it called a let? What was the actual outcome of the skill? Such that the example here is a golfer taking a shot, chipping in, trying to get onto the green. If that comes off the gentleman in the red shirt's head and then rolls along the green to the hole, for all intents and purposes, that is a chip in into the hole for just one shot. Technically, though, he would be very upset with the accuracy of that shot because I'm sure it wasn't intended. And in finishing up this slideshow, the two, I guess, key branches of all feedback are that it can be considered knowledge of performance or knowledge of results. In the case of knowledge performance, it really focuses on the process or the skill execution or the technique. So it doesn't consider the outcome or the result. I guess this type of feedback probably could work back down to the subroutines of a particular skill. And the example here, I've got someone might do the most technically correct drop punt in AFL football, having a set shot at goal. It's a beautiful technical kick, but it didn't get a goal. They went out of bounds on the full, even though they kicked it right off the middle of their foot and right through the center of the ball. So the performance was perfect, the result was not.